Chapter 5 of Workers Together. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Workers Together, or An Endless Chain, by Pansy. Chapter 5. Escaping the Net. A fellow can't be always struggling with his fate. I didn't want to go, I am sure. Anybody who has watched me all day knows just how hard I tried to get out of it, and I couldn't do it, and that's the whole of it. If I hadn't gone to that supper the other night and helped make the promises to carry this thing through, I wouldn't have got into the scrape. I half asked the Curtis girl to go with me then. If it hadn't been for that, I'm almost sure I wouldn't have gone a step. But what would she have thought of me if some of the others had invited her after what I said? All this he told himself gloomily while he waited for his knock to be answered. You will perceive that he hadn't quite gotten the better of his conscience even yet. The truth is, he had taken a letter from the post office on his way thither. He had not read it yet. Instead, he had thrust it into the depths of his inner pocket, with a half resolution to forget all about it until after he was home from the Bayville ride. But he knew the handwriting. Every curve of every letter in his name was as familiar to him as though he had watched his mother when she wrote it, and heard her murmured prayer as she bowed her head over it for a moment. And the something which warned him the loudest against his present course was the knowledge of how surely his mother would disapprove. Still, she would see for herself that I couldn't help it this time. It was the last self-excusing sentence that he had time to utter before his knock was answered by Delia herself. But her eyes were swollen with weeping. There were people standing in the little box of a hall, among them Dr. Everett, hat in hand, as if about to depart. The door into the little parlor was ajar, and behold, the object that greeted his amazed eyes was a flower-strewn coffin, wherein lay Delia's baby brother. What a strange way out of a snare was this! Dr. Everett held out his hand. "Ah, Austin, this is kind. Come in. I was just going in search of you. We want your help. Step in here with me a moment, will you?" And he led the way into the parlor with its one silent, beautiful occupant. Standing there, looking down into the little face, the doctor told how opportune was this call. That he especially desired to have singing at the funeral for the sake, more particularly, of the father and the mother. "They are not church-going people," he explained, "and they have few friends. Just at this time of sorrow they seem particularly desolate. Whatever we can do now for them in the most trivial way to show our sympathy, the Master may be able to use to his glory. I am so glad you came in. It was very thoughtful of you. Poor Delia is stricken. The child seems to have been the very joy of her heart. Her class in Sabbath school have been very kind and thoughtful, so has her teacher. These flowers are her work. Now, Barrows, about tomorrow. I think I can arrange for your absence from the store if you are willing to help us here." Whereupon he launched into a detailed explanation of the things to be done and the ways of doing. Austin Barrows listened and commented when necessary, and assented to his share in the work, as one in a dream. Standing beside that little coffin and looking into that beautiful sleeping face, Bayville House seemed more than 100 miles away, and all the details connected with the evening's entertainment faded like a hateful vision. Often afterwards Austin Barrows looked back upon that scene, when everything connected with it became of the past, and remembered curiously how firm his voice was, and how unhesitatingly he spoke the words, "I can't go, Parks. I have another engagement of far more importance." And when Robert Parks, annoyed as he always was when everything did not go precisely according to his planning, questioned hastily as to what he expected the Curtis girl would think of that, he remembered the little shade of almost triumph that his voice took on, as he answered that he had no doubt she would excuse him, since his other engagement was to officiate as singer, and then as bearer, at the funeral of her little brother. He remembered, too, the little start of surprise and dismay with which the news was received, and the grave response, "Oh, indeed! I did not know, I had not heard. Well, of course, that alters the case. Such things must be attended to." There was one power, then, before which Robert Parks would bow in grave submission. Death won respect even from him. Austin Barrows remembered it, and thought much about it. Dr. Everett stopped that evening in the little sitting room to have a word with Joy and her mother. You are to understand that, although it was only since he became superintendent of the Packard Place Sabbath School that he had discovered Mrs. Saunders' boarding house and removed thither, he was already quite at home, even in the little sitting room, which belonged to but few. "Mrs. Saunders," he said, standing before her, "were not you and I to spread a net somewhere, somehow, to catch that young man Parks?" "I remember you spoke of it, Doctor, and I've thought about it several times since, but I don't see my way clear. Do you?" He shook his head. "I doubt whether we should wait always for clear ways. Perhaps we are expected to go creeping along in the dark. He needs catching sadly, I fear. Satan has ways, and doesn't scruple to use them. Do you happen to be acquainted with the locality of the Bayville house?" "Know every foot of the way to it in the dark." "How would you like to have Miss Joy here invited to take an evening ride with some gentlemen, and spend a few hours there in the company that she would meet?" "Dr. Everett!" said Mrs. Saunders, and her brow darkened, and she half gathered herself up and looked toward Joy as if to shield her. "Yes," said the doctor significantly, "so I supposed. And yet, Mrs. Saunders, there are mothers whose daughters go there, and whose sons go there. Some of them are at home, I dare say, weeping and praying. The question is, what are you and I going to do for these daughters and sons? That young Parks, I am told, has a mother, and a very good one. On this particular evening he is the leader of a wild party of young men and women who will spend half the night at the Bayville house. What can we do for him? I am thankful that young Austin Barrows escaped that snare. Yet I almost wonder that he did, and I confess I don't in the least know how to reach the other one." Yet the same hand that arranged the links in the chain that should hold Austin Barrows away from that evening's danger, knew how also to weave the chain for the other. In point of fact, it was being woven at that moment. It was the very next morning but one, somewhere between the hours of 10 and 12, that the young man Robert Parks attempted to turn himself on his bed, and found that he could not. He tried to raise his right arm to his head, and found that it wouldn't obey his direction. In great amazement over this state of things, he opened his eyes, and encountered a pair of keen gray ones regarding him with attentive interest. "Good morning," said he of the gray eyes, and was rewarded only by a bewildered stare from young Parks. Presently a question. "Who on earth are you?" "Dr. Everett, at your service. How do you find yourself?" "Some of myself I don't find. What has become of my left foot?" "Safe, tucked under the bedclothes. It hasn't much feeling in it, I dare say. But it will come around all right. For a time I was doubtful. But I hope now that you will pull through." "Pull through what? What is supposed to be the matter? Why am I here? And for the matter of that, where is here? I never was in this room before. What has happened?" "Have you no recollection of anything happening?" "Why, yes, of course, a great many things have happened to me. But just now, I mean, how did I happen here?" "It is a long story, young man. If you don't recall any of it, perhaps it is just as well not to trouble your brain about it yet." "Excuse me, doctor, my brain is my master. It will be troubled in spite of me. Tell me everything about it." "Oh, well, I can give you a brief summary. The fact is, you have been in the hands of Shishak." "Shishak? Don't know him. Who is the fellow? He has treated me abominably, I should say." "So he has, but you are coming off better in the conflict than I expected. That is, if you see to it that he lets you alone after this. Of course, it remains to be seen whether or not you have sense enough for that. I'm a little afraid of you. His victims generally seem to have an insane desire to make another trial." "What do you mean, doctor? Speak English, please." "Isn't it English? Your name is Rehoboam, is it not?" I hope not. I have never heard of even a relative by that name. Possible, said the doctor, lifting his eyebrows in seeming astonishment. I have been watching you for some weeks, with the impression that I had found the individual so famous in history. Singular that you and he should have so similar an experience. How do you account for it? But Robert Parks's bewildered brain just at that moment wandered in another direction. You've been watching me, doctor, where and for how long? I haven't lain here long, have I? Only about 36 hours, or a trifle more. You were unconscious for a while, and after your injuries were dressed, you went into a tremendous sleep. There were a couple of hours when I greatly feared that you did not mean to waken, but you see you have. Injuries? Why, let me see. I was on the Bayville Road. Ah, I remember now. My horse took fright at his own shadow. Whereupon you whipped him, said Dr. Everett, continuing the story, which, if you were well, I should want to tell you was a very senseless proceeding on your part, under the circumstances. And he ran, as of course, given such an occasion, any sensible horse would have done. And the consequence is, here you are. But what about that fellow you spoke of? What had he to do with it, and who is he, anyhow? Oh, that, said the doctor, drawing on his gloves, was a slip of the tongue. You reminded me strikingly of the young man who fell into his hands. Not only this instance reminds me, but several others connected with you. As I said before, I have been taking observations for some weeks. However, you don't seem to be well posted in ancient history, and my advice to you is to give over thinking of Shishak until you get well. Then you can trace the resemblance if you choose. What you are to do at present is, to obey my orders with what grace you are able. Don't try to lift yourself. Let your arm alone. Be as much of an oyster as possible. Take what is brought to you meekly, whether it is pill or gruel. And get well as fast as you can. If you are reasonably obedient, which you probably will not be, I look for rapid improvement. But, doctor, said young Parks, trying to turn his head to look after the already retreating figure of the doctor, just one moment, please. Where am I? Do my people know of this accident? And what has become of my situation? One moment! Why, my dear sir, that will take at least a dozen. Where are you? In my boarding house. It was my carriage which came along opportunely about the same time that you flung yourself from your own. I picked you up, and not knowing anything better to do, brought you here to the corner of Albany Street, where, with the help of a blundering boy, and my landlady, Mrs. Saunders, as superintendent, and myself too for general-in-chief, we hope to make you as good as new in a short time. I took the liberty of at once writing to your mother. The junior partner in your store gave me the address, and being in need of a patient just then, I offered my services, which were accepted. So you will have to obey me, you observe. Your mother bade me say that she would come to you at once, only you would understand that she could not get away. I assured her that there was no need. Your situation is still waiting for you, and will wait, at least until I can talk with you at more length. You have talked more than is well for you already. I prescribe a nap, and bid you good morning. And that was all Robert Parks could glean of the new story which had suddenly begun in his life. Despite the orders to lie still, he turned himself restlessly on his pillow, and indulged in a long-drawn sigh. There was a dark side to this sudden shutting down of his plans. He knew only too well how impossible it was for his mother to get away from his father's bedside, even for an hour. That sick and suffering father, upon whom disease had wrought such havoc that only one idea seemed left to feed upon, the determination not to lose sight for even a moment of his faithful wife. How much she needed rest and change, Robert knew. How sorrowful it was to add a weight of anxiety to her already burdened life, he felt. It was no wonder that he sighed. If he could have heard what that mother said, after the doctor's long, kind, carefully worded letter was concluded, I wonder if it would have startled him. When the first burst of anxious fear was over, rereading the letter, the far-seeing mother had discovered something about the man who wrote it, and had given voice to 100 nameless anxieties, by saying with a sigh that had yet a note of relief in it: "There is one comfort, Alice. As long as he is on his back, and under that man's care, he will be out of the reach of some of those young men who seem to have been his constant companions of late." "Yes," Alice had said, and then she had added, "Mamma, sometimes I am afraid that Robert is safer on his back than he is anywhere else." Alice was 16, and his only sister. If he had heard her, what would he have thought? At that moment he was thinking of her. "Confound it all!" he said angrily, trying with his lame hand to brush away a tear. "They have enough to bear without this." Then the door opened very softly, and he turned to look at the intruder. Chapter 6.